5, 4, 3.
Oh, that's great.
2, 1.
All right then. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue. It's time for the Amish Inquisition yet again, episode 388 on Sunday, the 24th of August, 2025. I'm Phil.
I'm Fat Ben.
And I'm Matt.
And, tonight we're very happy to be joined by author and researcher Michael Anthony Alberta. How you doing, Michael?
Here I am. I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me. It's an honor. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, you're most welcome. We love a bit of sort of alternative history and different hypotheses about what happened in the past and where maybe the mainstream narrative is missing things or getting things wrong. So I was very excited when we hooked up over email and got to have a look at your book. Encrypted Reality is the name of the book, right?
It is. I'm not sure if you guys are hearing the feedback in the background, but I'm hearing the beginning of our conversation recording in my. I could go on. It's not the end of the world, but I don't know if you guys, if it's affecting the video, if maybe people listening to this are experiencing the same thing.
Have you got any tabs open, like YouTube or Facebook or something where it might be playing?
That's me. Look at.
Turn your radio down, please, caller. It's all right. It's no problem. We couldn't hear it at our end, so it might just have been on your end. But don't worry about it.
The people in the chat will tell us they're usually good about the audio, aren't they?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, guys, thank you again. Thank you for having me. This is going to be great, man. There's a lot of elements that I've previously talked on different podcasts, but I've never really got into detail in terms of the English or British history, so to speak, specifically through Francis Bacon. So I'd like to explore that further today.
Oh, that's exciting because we've done an episode on Francis Bacon before.
I noticed.
It was well received.
Yeah, and we've got a load of unsold merchandise.
Well, cool. Let's pitch it, baby. Let's do it. I mean, Francis Bacon, John Dee, that whole clique. You know, there's some serious stuff going on at that time, especially when you tie it into Anatoly Fomenko's work on the new chronology. You know, what he argues is the vast majority of world history was fabricated during the actual lifetime of Francis Bacon, not specifically by Francis Bacon, but he points out Joseph Justus Scaliger and Petavius, a Jesuit. However, if you match up the dates, which I was just I did that like a couple months ago, and I realized, oh wow, look at that! It just so happens to fall under. So anyway, Francis Bacon. This time, what I'm actually going to do, since there's so much that tie in to Francis Bacon specifically, I'm going to read parts from my book, then pause and maybe expand on certain things, because there's so many ways that once I start talking about Francis Bacon, and this is what's happened on so many podcasts before, is it just goes into other directions, and I can never really harken back to Bacon. So I'm going to try to I'm going to try to bulldoze through as much of this text as I can for your listeners. So I'll just fire off.
Yeah, sounds great.
So there's basically my book, The Encrypted Reality, revolves around a character in the 15th century, specifically Leon Battista Alberti, who goes by several aliases because, after all, this is like a spy novel. It revolves around espionage. So there's different aliases he goes by. So for sake of the readers, I basically consolidate the name into G. So the precise circumstances of G's death and under what specific aliases he may have perished remain unknown. However, and he died in 1472. So Francis Bacon, his work was basically revamped. How his influential work was significantly revitalized and expanded upon the efforts of Sir Francis Bacon, who was born in 1561 and died in 1626. Many scholars regard Christian Rosenkreuz as a pseudonym for Francis Bacon himself. I get into Christian Rosenkreuz earlier. He's allegedly the progenitor of the Rosicrucians, which eventually morphs into Freemasonry. However, once it's strange that they do this because based on Rosicrucian documents, they say their father was born in like 1402 and died. It remarkably lines up with Alberti's dates of dying and living. Not exactly, but long before Francis Bacon. So it's difficult to kind of square that circle. In any event, Francis Bacon, a theory supported by his documented Rosicrucian affiliations in Germany. So we do know that Francis Bacon was heavily involved with those German Rosicrucians. I mean, that's what we know as far as history. I wasn't there, so I can't be like, yep, I was, I seen him hanging out with those Rosicrucians. This is hearsay. This strategic proliferation of aliases and cultivation of hidden identities, a methodology perfected by G, was subsequently. Oh no, we don't have to get into that. Let me forward a little bit here. Okay, another pivotal figure connected to this intricate network was Roger Bacon, whose deep commitment to the Franciscan order is reflected in the very name adopted by Francis Bacon. So I argue that Francis Bacon isn't even really this individual's real name. It's more like a cipher.
Okay.
Claims of hidden ciphers and coded messages within the plays of William Shakespeare supposedly reveal Bacon as the true author. And the reason I mention that is because this whole, I guess, international spy ring, I label the watch because they weave in and out of so many different organizations and religions. You can't really say it's these people. So that's the overarching term I've given them. And they're all basically united through cryptography. And this is one of Bacon's fortes. So G's profound insights into optical intelligence were symbolically represented on his personal emblem. The advanced intelligence was further developed through the optical workshops of Luca Pacioli, who was also a notable Franciscan friar. Also, I don't think I mentioned this here, but Pacioli also brought the divine porzione, the golden ratio. He's the first one that had an actual printed articulation of that. And that relates to art, that relates to double entry bookkeeping, specifically through Pacioli. That's where we get these international banksters from. That's where this knowledge. But what's really fascinating with the double entry bookkeeping, which gets into other things, is this mathematical sequence, specifically the Fibonacci sequence, has been documented multiple times. And in fact, it's been used for banking or proto banking in the Roman Empire. And then it mysteriously disappeared during the Dark Ages, which is difficult for me to fathom. So in any event, the advanced intelligence was further Pacioli's extensive work, too, is said to have drawn directly from the intellectual traditions established by Roger Bacon. So, and this is another thing with Roger Bacon. Although gunpowder was first invented and described in China, Roger Bacon was the first European to formally record its formula. So modern firearms are asserted to descend directly from Chinese firecrackers, the knowledge of which was obtained by Franciscans. So when you think of like major technical advances, I argue in my book it was the printing press, guns, and the nautical sail that essentially allowed Europeans to dominate the world in the 15th century. And guns was really the pivotal. It's just interesting how this guy Francis Bacon, you look at Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar, Francis Bacon, and Franciscan friars, which let me get into them more here. All right, so modern firearms operating as official Vatican inquisitors, because that's what they were. They were inquisitors, the Franciscans. They were employed torture against suspects to extract confessions. This is all known stuff. This is nothing I'm saying right now is speculation. Using tactics such as witch hunts as a chilling means to conceal political motivated assassins. A stark demonstration of leveraging societal fear for clandestine operations. That's a little more speculative, as far as them being agents of the watch. That's obviously my take. Despite the absence, guys, you could pause me whenever I want. I'm just trying to make sure I don't veer off into too many because there's a lot of directions. The book essentially encapsulates all this, but okay. So despite the absence of definitive evidence or blood relation to Francis, Roger Bacon, born 1214, died 1294, and Sir Francis Bacon are asserted to have shared the same Norman ancestry. Now, the Normans are a friggin' that gets into a whole other can of worms, which we can get into. But for now, the bloodline was reportedly granted feudal overlordship over territories in northern France, specifically the Duchy of Normandy, a historical period that was remixed into the 10th century from the 14th century. English, a West Germanic language spoken in medieval England, is presented as a linguistic fusion of Old Norman French and Latin. So and basically throughout my book, I get into, because you can study this watch through language, specifically through the alphabet, because those are two prongs of communication. You got the alphabet and then you have language. It's easy to conflate the two, but I get into the evolution of both from its very early beginnings from the Nostralic languages and Proto-European, and then you can see the evolution. That's why I'm bringing this up. But so basically, the Vikings, North Germanic language, Old Norse, eventually integrated into Standard English, thereby illustrating the profound linguistic influence of groups affiliated to the watch. Tensions between the French and English crowns are traced back to the English royal family itself, which possessed Norman origins. In 1066, the Norman, and guys, correct me if I'm wrong, because this is your history. If I'm fucking up, by all means, throughout this entire, call me out if you know something I don't. I'm always adjusting this timeline.
Okay.
So we got English royal family.
1066.
Yep, 1066. The Norman Duke William the Conqueror was crowned King of England. British monarchs historically retained royal titles and owned significant landholdings within France, which technically may have rendered them vassals to the French, which I'm still not exactly sure on that. Norman conquest and direct rule effectively ceased around the same historical junction that Quetzalcoatl reportedly arrived in the Americas and the disappearance of the Mayan civilization. Quetzalcoatl, in my opinion, is descended from Normans. If you look at the... Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm saying it with a straight face. This isn't real. This is one of those things where I normally don't even co-sign something. Even in my book, I kind of like leave it a little bit speculative, like what if? But there's so many things pointing to the Vikings being in. Well, we know they were in Greenland at the time. That's a historical fact. So who's really to say that they didn't go a little bit more south? And we know the genetics tell us there were. R1A haplogroups which relate to Vikings. That haplogroup entered the southern, so there was intermarriages. Like, for example, the Aztecs are considered multi-ethnic prior to the Spanish because they were all kinds of shades of people, and it just so happens the elite were a little bit more light skinned. I mean, listen, a lot of this stuff is based on the Spanish the communicating, translations, which obviously they have their own biases. But there's also, for example, with this Quetzalcoatl character, the same time, because a lot of people, they see swastikas in the Americas and Native American this is the same time swastikas popped up in the Americas. There's a lot of other correlations related to the 10th century and the 11th century. And this Quetzalcoatl character. I've gotten into that.
Sorry, Michael. I think we're well open to the possibility of the Americas. We've had guests previously talk about Hebrews in North America. There's been evidence of Roman wreckages off North America.
There has.
But you mentioned Quetzalcoatl, which to me is like a mythical god type figure no.
Quetzalcoatl is a historical figure. And sometimes he goes by Totzin Quetzalcoatl. So he was deified after he was essentially exiled by the locals. And this is a common pattern you see with these spy masters who subvert they usually the local population tend to the mob comes. But the point being is that this Quetzalcoatl character, I've gotten into this extensively in other podcasts. But we can, when you get into the Aztec culture, so I argue that Nezahualcóyotl, who is a descendant of Quetzalcoatl, is Leon Battista Alberti. This gets into I don't want it because this will probably take an hour, which we can get into this, but let's just get into this because you guys are interested. So Quetzalcoatl, I suspect that humanism, which is, usually associated with Europe and stuff like that, was actually something crafted in the Americas. And the reason I say this is because when this guy Nezahualcóyotl, who was a Toltec, the Toltecs is essentially how you can tie Quetzalcoatl to, because basically even after Quetzalcoatl was exiled, his family still had control over the Americas. It wasn't just Mexico. Like the Toltec sphere is extensive. That's why a lot of people have a hard time determining what's Maya, what's Inca, what's Aztec, is because of these Toltecs specifically. So the Toltecs, I argue, were Vikings. I mean, they were. It was either maybe a ship that got, and they came with obvious. They had knowledge that the locals didn't have, and the locals had knowledge they didn't have. And I think they combined this stuff, and people deified them. Like, well, where the fuck did this come from? You know, like that's not so far fetched to. But I try not to get too.
Sorry, it sounds similar to what Graham Hancock would talk about in Fingerprints of the Gods about the. It's kind of unfashionable to use this kind of language these days, but he talks about white bearded guys turning up in ships and then being sort of worshipped by the native populations.
Well, that's what happened even. Right? Exactly. What the fuck? Where's my ship privilege? But no, the whole thing is like, yeah, I mean, when the conquistadors showed up, that's the psyop they used. Cortez, he said he was a descendant of Quetzalcoatl. And so a lot of people say, how did a handful of Vikings manage, it keeps going back to fight, how did a handful of conquistadors manage to control, like they held Montezuma up hostage in his own castle. And you have to ask yourself, how is this even possible? At first, I thought he was like a vassal of some sort. But then when I actually looked into it, this gets into the whole idea of behavioral modernity in the work of Julian Jaynes, who's a psychologist. And it gets into the idea of the bicameral mind, which, like I say, a lot of history probably didn't start until the 10th century because the vast majority of the world was most likely in the Stone Age. And I rationalized that whole idea with, number one, the work of Anatoly Fomenko, who's a mathematician and astrologer who's done statistical analysis to basically verify. I'm not saying I co-sign all his stuff, but I go with that, and I fuse that with the work of Julian Jaynes, who basically argues that humans were not behaviorally modern until the Bronze Age collapsed because of literacy, widespread literacy. There was cataclysms that basically shocked us into, and you could actually see this in written documents, like any kind of work that was made before the Bronze Age collapse. There's no real introspective eye, like in Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh or all these ancient Egyptian stuff. Like everyone seems to be praying to gods or looking for gods for advice, and there's no real self-awareness. So that's how I get into the idea of how the conquistadors entered because these people were still fundamentally bicameral. And there's still people today that are fundamentally bicameral. A lot of this relates to literacy. That's why I harken back to the printing press in the 15th century, because that's when humanity first, there was a critical mass of people that actually became literate, which instigated. Then there's the fall of Constantinople, the Black Death. There was a series of events that led to what we consider today behaviorally modern. So moving forward, Francis Bacon, because you see, it's so easy to just. So Francis Bacon could plausibly be argued as a foundational architect of the English language as it is spoken today, owing to his pivotal role in shaping modern scientific thought, promoting empirical reasoning, and advocating for linguistic clarity during a period when English was transitioning from its medieval forms into a standard, expressive, and intellectually rigorous language. As the widely recognized father of the scientific method, Bacon rigorously insisted upon the use of clear, precise, and functionally oriented language to communicate observations. And like me, I'm multilingual. And like English allows you to articulate language in ways that I'm not saying I only speak two languages. But my point is that like Spanish is a lot more direct. With English, there's a lot of subtleties. There's a lot of room for expansion, and you can. So anyway, Bacon rigorously insisted upon clear. Okay, Bob. Though his seminal works, such as the Advancement of Learning Bacon, not only legitimize English as a suitable vehicle for philosophy and science, domains previously reserved almost exclusively for Latin, Latin or Greek. Yeah. Also established linguistic standards that subsequent generations of writers, scholars, and compilers of dictionaries and grammars. His intellectual influence pervaded the Royal Society, an institution whose motto, nullus un verba, on the word of no one, directly reflected Baconian ideals. The members of this prestigious society would in turn shape the evolution of English, because that's what most people, they'll associate to Bacon, but it's really that Royal Society that made it the lingua franca that it is today.
And drove the Enlightenment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So, all right. So Roger Bacon. So I didn't highlight this paragraph, but let me try to blow through it. Roger Bacon, also recognized as the academic accolade Dr. Mirabilis, whose empirical philosophy approach was continued and built upon by Francis Bacon, is seen reflected the intellect with the intellectual legacy of Al-Kindi. So this is what's interesting with Roger Bacon. If you were to superimpose the Wikipedia profiles of Roger Bacon, Al-Kindi, and Alberti and look at their biographies and look at what they're known for doing, you'd see some shocking reflections. So these are the kind of like red flags that go off in my head when I start seeing people's because there's certain things that seems to have been lost. And so, anyway, such textual cues are presented as a method of communication designed to authenticate his existence to future audience capable of deciphering meticulously crafted timeline. I'm going to fast forward this because this gets into for instance, Roger Bacon applied Al-Kindi's empirical method to observations found in texts attributed to Aristotle. And Al-Kindi's reported assisted the Nestorians in remixing Greco-Roman, Syriac, and Persian works. Yeah, I'd have to get into the whole, that's why I didn't highlight this, because I'd have to get into Al-Kindi's story and that. But let me stick to Roger Bacon and these guys, because this is it gets good, guys. Just bear with me. I know right now it seems a little, just hear me out. I got something here. For example, a scientific diary purported written by Roger Bacon was composed in a highly abbreviated Gothic Latin, utilizing a substitution cipher. So these guys are all, like I said, that's all involved with cryptography.
Right.
Much like Alberti, Roger Bacon's linguistic work has been celebrated for its early exposition of universal grammar. So it's not just Alberti, because Alberti is known for bringing like the Italian that we speak today. He was a linguist. The Italian that Italians speak today, so you see this also reflected in Roger Bacon. Not only Roger Bacon, so I guess Roger Bacon planted the seeds for English, and then Francis Bacon really took it to the next level. So linguistic work has been celebrated for its Alberti's Della Pictura explicitly relied on Bacon's optical theories in determining perspective. So that's another thing. The Renaissance is known, like when you say, okay, what started the Renaissance? A lot of people will associate Petrarch, who he brought back a lot of old texts and stuff like that. But in reality, when you look at it, it's really the perspective. Like if you were to go on the Wikipedia, because when I keep harkening back to Wikipedia, I wrote this book originally before large language models. So my main platform for coming to these conclusions was revisiting Wikipedia pages over like a 10-year period, because this was like a hobby. And then eventually I'm like, there's a narrative here. So that's what this is. Both men are particularly accredited with revisiting a worldwide universal curriculum, which notably included the addition of optics to the traditional quadrivium, indicating a coordinated and deliberate educational reform. This intellectual transmission spanning centuries, manifesting through interconnected polymaths, demonstrates how the watch meticulously preserved and advanced critical scientific knowledge, thereby ensuring its continuality strategic across different eras, across various aliases and proxies. Similar to Alberti and Al-Kindi, Bacon's contemporaries largely overlooked him in favor of other scholars. So you can see this, with a lot of different people. In his case, it was Thomas Aquinas, although Aquinas did study Bacon's work. So like, for some reason, all these people that are in my book that I see make pivotal, they seem to be overshadowed by somebody just a little bit more popular in his generation. So Alberti's life is said to shine through Roger Bacon's, particularly in Opus Majus, especially in how it is sent to the Pope of Rome in 1267. Roger Bacon has been proposed as a possible author of the Voynich manuscript, which I believe Alberti initially wrote the Voynich manuscript because it also relates to enciphered Nahuatl, which is Nezahual's language, and the paint they actually trace to Mexico. So the Voynich manuscript ties the whole book together.
Michael,
it's interesting.
Michael, you have to explain what the Voynich manuscript is.
Absolutely.
People
so the
never heard of
Voynich
it
manuscript.
like me.
It's what you'd call an illuminated manuscript. It's bound in like sheepskin, and it's very these kind of, prior to the printing press, most books were developed like this. It was a tedious process, but this book is basically has been involved with espionage. Like, for example, it was no one has enciphered, no one's cracked it, so no one really knows what it says. It's got all kinds of crazy images and a text no one really understands, but there is telltale signs that the text is a language of some sort. Now, the reason it's tied to espionage is because all throughout history, if you look at who's had their hands on it, they're documented like in the historical record. All these people were somehow tied to espionage in one way, shape, or form. You know, like I said, Roger Bacon and then John Dee they think is the author. I argue that it was Alberti, and there's a lot of reasons why. Because number one, this Voynich manuscript, it's been carbon dated, which I don't trust carbon dating totally, but it's just an interesting coincidence that the carbon dating reflects where and when. So if they say it somewhere in northern Italy, specifically Florence, and at the time, Alberti wrote another manuscript. He wrote many manuscripts. So, and not only that, Alberti's considered the father of European cryptography. So he developed the polyalphabetic cipher, and we get into that also ties everything. But when they say, how did this Voynich manuscript even get developed, they argue it was some kind of polyalphabetic cipher, but you would essentially need a code book to really understand it. And without prior, unless you have that code book, I assume it's impossible. Maybe with AI, maybe eventually something's going to come to light, and eventually I'll be vindicated. I won't sound like such a wacko, but I really do think that there's something to like this Voynich manuscript, because all throughout my book, when I start looking at who had their hands on it, you say, wow, there's no accident. So, for example, right now it's housed in Yale. Yale is that's where the Skull and Bones come from. It's a secret society, a lot of presidents and stuff. Now, Skull and Bones was also the major recruitment center for the CIA, which is the Central Intelligence Administration, it's the spies of the United States. Now, there's a lot of coincidences there where you see, okay, and then even after that, the NSA tried cracking it. You look at Alan Turing at Bletchley Park; he tried cracking the Voynich manuscript, and this is the guy that cracked the Enigma machine, Alan Turing. It saved millions, like 7-8 million lives. Now, mind you, the Enigma machine is an electric polyalphabetic cipher, and who invented the polyalphabetic cipher? Alberti. So you keep seeing the trails. But let me stick to Bacon a little bit more, because he's when you get into like the final Renaissance man, like Alberti's work, in every generation there's a spy master, and I speculate that he was subverted after his death. The watch became corrupt by a figure that I don't know exactly who it is, so I just call him the mole. But it looks like Francis Bacon managed to get control of this agency, a couple hundred years later, and make it for the greater good. Because I think this agency is not it's not all bad. There's definitely sugar with the poison. But there is, I think that they do operate to preserve the human race. I mean, I'm sure they have, seniority, I'd imagine. I don't know what the word for it is. I'm looking for it. But, I do think that ultimately, because they capitalize off cataclysm. So by default, they're preserving humanity. I don't think these are aliens or, a lot of people speculate on that. And I'm not saying that they could be. I just haven't seen an alien or any kind of spirit or anything like that.
Do you think the watch set up the Georgia Guidestones?
I mean, it's possible. It's possible. I think because the Georgia Guidestones, you see other monoliths like that pop up, and there's still a mystery about who did the Georgia Guidestones, and a lot of them point to Freemasonry. Yeah. And I do think Freemasonry. I don't think Freemasonry at all in general is the watch, but I do think that throughout history it has been compromised, and I think even in its initial stages, I basically almost all religions and even civilizations have been, at least the history that we are taught, it seems as though the watch has has integrated itself in the foundational myths of organizations, religions, that's how they recruit the brightest minds of each nation. Because when people start to read their histories and they see that it's been compromised by a foreign invasion, they want to figure out who are those people, because that's usually where the power lies. And if you look at what Friedrich Nietzsche, everyone is chasing power at some capacity. That's debatable, because I sure as hell don't want to be a part of the watch. But it's still, some people, we're monkeys after all. We're silly talking monkeys. We want to swing from the strongest branch. So anyway, I digress. Roger Bacon has been proposed as a possible author of the Voynich manuscript. Bacon was indeed knowledgeable about ciphers. Nonetheless, the estimating dating of the Voynich manuscript roughly coincides with the cipher discs from Alberti. So that's a connection between the two. Okay. Sir Francis Bacon ultimately emulated Alberti's approach by ejecting the philosophical foundations of occultism to develop what is now termed modern science, thereby suggesting a deliberate and orchestrated shift in intellectual paradigm. Now, why I say this is because that shit, occultism and all that stuff was a way to control people that were in a bicameral state. So whenever we look at these occult ideas in the past, or even in the present, even like any kind, even religion, like this heart, we still have vestiges of this consciousness inside of us. That's why when we see totalitarian regimes and dictators, this is our desire to look for guidance. So these people were using occultism and gods, and just knowing a god's name was like a password to certain cults. So basically, Francis Bacon comes about long after the printing press. He comes about long after humanity has transitioned, not long after, probably 100, 200 years after humanity has, when I say collectively, maybe a critical mass, like 60% or something like that. Because even to this day, like I said, there are bicameral, we can see that. And when I say bicameral, I guess the best way to describe them are like schizophrenics. It's like almost like a schizophrenic state of mind, where it's like, you see this in children with the imaginary friend, or like, and sometimes when we have dreams, we can be, but Julian Jaynes, for your viewers, Julian Jaynes's work is not for the mentally fatigued, because I still am trying to process. His book is called the Origin of Consciousness, and the something that it's a long-winded thing, and it's something the bicameral mind, the Origin of Consciousness, Julian Jaynes. Mm-hmm. So I'll proceed here. Francis Bacon was not merely another spy master of this non-attributable strike force. He was a highly influential English philosopher and statesman who held the esteemed positions of Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England. The establishment of a reliable postal service was crucial, and this is so, as it enabled him to engage in scholarly communications, subject to peer review and verification. Francis Bacon had successfully deciphered a complex code system that relied on intercepted mail and dispatches. A select number of agents embedded within the postal system intercepted correspondences and forwarded them to its intended recipient after they had reached London. Much like Alberti in his native tongue, Sir Francis Bacon was widely recognized as an excellent writer in the English language. Like the spy masters of old, he was a notable patron of libraries, and he developed a highly functional system of cataloging books. That's another telltale sign. The watch leaves behind a lot of ways you can kind of figure out who's working for them, and especially when it comes to knowledge. I mean, we see this now in the manifestation of large language models. 10 years ago, it was social media like Instagram. So whoever's in control of the narrative, because when you control the past, you can kind of control the future, and vice versa. If you control the future, But my point is, if you can control like a lot of dynasties and kingships and stuff, they're based on the historical narrative. So if you can manipulate that somehow, you can change the trajectory of history. And this is really why I wrote the book, is so people they don't got a lot of this stuff. I unless I was there, I can't. A lot of this is speculation. But the idea is to question the narratives and understand why it would be conducive for some people to manipulate the narrative. Okay, so the Neoplatonic Florentines Academy had a concept of an underlying order, exemplified by the network of astronomers, professionals, mathematicians, and natural philosophers active in the Roman Empire, was actively promoted in the 16th century. Johannes Kepler and John Dee, here we go, John Dee, who famously founded the Invisible College, serve as a compelling example of this phenomenon. This intellectual lineage eventually led to the establishment of the Royal Society in 1660. Both organizations functioned as vehicles for a hidden agenda, providing a structured environment for advancing knowledge and shaping the emerging scientific paradigm. Now, when I say hidden agendas, like that doesn't mean, like I said, it's not always nefarious. It's a two-pronged approach, you know, that you that's how you get people to digest the information. Both Dee and Bacon are sometimes claimed as forebearers of the Royal Society, founded in 1660, though Bacon's influence is more direct. Dee's experimental approach to natural philosophy, even if wrapped in mysticism, helped pave the way for Bacon's later reforms. Dee was a prominent figure in the Elizabethan England, while Bacon rose to prominence under James I. Thus, they moved in overlapping courtly and intellectual circles. Bacon's older brother, Anthony Bacon, was involved in intelligence networks that intersected with Dee's own espionage activities. These are known spies. You know, once we get into the 16th and 17th century, then it's less speculation, but you still see that the telltale signs in the past.
Michael, sorry to interrupt. Does Francis Walsingham fit into this? Because
he does. I'm right about to bring him up.
Oh, cool.
Yep, sure does. The Invisible College, operating as an informal network of natural philosophers, fostered intellectual exchange and collaboration, discreetly laying the groundwork for the more formalized Royal Society. Through these institutions, the Watch could strategically promote favored scientific methodologies, disseminate curated discoveries, and recruit key intellects, thereby ensuring the controlled progression of scientific thought and technological development that aligned with their overarching objectives in societal engineering. Ian Fleming famously modeled his iconic 007 James Bond character on John Dee. Dee is frequently associated with Merlin, the legendary wizard of Arthurian lore. While not strictly a spy story, the Arthurian mythos contains numerous elements of espionage, secret identities, the presence of double agents, hidden agendas, covert missions, and the systemic gathering of intelligence. A modern reinterpretation of the Arthurian legend could highlight these elements as a foundational to the rise and fall of his court. Both Dee and Kepler continued Alberti's intellectual tradition in the field of optics, as did their contemporary Galileo Galilei, widely revered as the father of astronomy, physics, and the scientific method. So that's kind of odd because both Galileo and Francis Bacon are considered the fathers of the scientific method. Galileo notably named 4 of Jupiter's moons after Cosimo de' Medici and his 3 brothers. Cosimo de' Medici had employed numerous translators in Florence. So Cosimo de' Medici and Alberti, the reason I bring the Medicis up, specifically Cosimo, because he was a major patron of this whole widespread fabrication. This is when the printing press came out. This is when, so this is a later Cosimo. This is a later, so there's different, yeah, this is the Cosimo II. But the original Cosimo, he was part of the Neoplatonic Florentine Academy. And the Medicis are very much involved with this. However, so they're known as like the richest people the richest family in the world of the 15th century. But it's interesting because when you look at the 14th century, the papal bankers was the Alberti family. Now that's Leon Battista Alberti's family, who, you know, the Medici family had intermarried with the Alberti family prior to them becoming a global banking, you know. Wow. So yeah, and I get into that in detail in the book, but it's just one of those things you could start to trace the lineage. Now, and I argue that the Alberti family actually come from Canaan, which is, you know, modern day Israel, Palestine, call it what you will. So Dee played a pivotal intellectual role in laying the ideological foundation for the British Empire. He is credited with coining the term British Empire, which provided crucial navigational expertise and geopolitical counsel that supported England's early maritime expansion. His vision and imperial destiny was deeply infused with esoteric and apocalyptic beliefs, portraying England as a chosen nation destined to usher in a new global order. Now, it's interesting when they talk about map making. Now, Toscanelli, who gave the map to Columbus, studied with Alberti. Alberti, and you know, I argue that Alberti, again, he came from the Americas. He was a Toltec. He watched his father get murdered in front of him, went to Peru, started the Aztec Empire, and then came back, started went to Peru, started the Inca Empire, then came back to avenge his father's death, started and all this you can see because they deleted the history before the Spanish. Their narrative was based on Quetzalcoatl coming back. It was like they were worshiping a religion that was a self-fulfilling belief of their own destruction. But that I get into that and other things, and I don't want to veer away from Roger and Francis right now. So D. Okay, so he's credited with the term. Okay, his vision, imperial destiny. Oh, the reason, like I said, the maps. Not only the map with Toscanelli, but Lorenzo de' Medici gave the map to Amerigo Vespucci, another map. So there's two different maps that you can. The only two maps that Europeans came to the Americas with, you can trace them to Alberti. So this is an interesting tidbit. So by synthesizing Renaissance science, Hermetic philosophy, and Christian mysticism, Dee helped to frame empire not merely as a process of conquest, but as a divinely sanctioned mission of enlightenment and order. Ideals would profoundly resonate through British colonial ideology. The British became the largest empire in world history, spanning the 16th to 20th centuries. At its peak, it controlled vast territories across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania, influencing global trade, politics, and culture. Driven by exploration, colonization, and industrialization, Britain established dominance through naval power and economic exploitation. Utilizing ciphers, Dee meticulously concealed his messages with Queen Elizabeth I. She also appointed Francis Walsingham as her international secretary and intelligence chief.
Yep.
Walsingham's staff. Did you want to get into that, Matt?
Yeah, he's an interesting character, Walsingham.
Yeah,
Elizabeth's spymaster.
Right? So this is how their knowledge of acquisition, division, and intercepted materials that either indicated their own activities or exposed historical conspiracies. While foreign intelligence has been the standard part of their duties, John Dee infused his work with ambitious strategic intent. He leveraged and exploited existing links across Turkey and Algiers and skillfully inserted contacts among Vatican exiles. Ironically, Dee was said to have used an Aztec obsidian smoking mirror to scribe for his visions. In retrospect, and that Aztec obsidian mirror came from who? Pachacuti. Pachacuti is basically the guy that started the Inca Empire, which is Nezahualcóyotl. And the reason I say it's Nezahualcóyotl because who's Pachacuti's father? Viracocha. Viracocha is the identical person they associate to Quetzalcoatl. So it's the same motif, the bearded friggin' guy. The whole spiel. So you see, there's a lot of correlations between, and it just so happens that John Dee is scrying with with Pat. And it's funny because Pachacuti's name translated was actually originally Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. And mind you, the Inca didn't call him this name until after he left. And the name is he who overturns space and time. Okay, that's what it translates to. And it just so happens when he left, the name also, Pachacuti by itself, translates to cataclysm. And right after he left, they were all kind of bad shit happened. So that's it's just a little ironic. Today's numerous prolific fraternal organizations. So now let's go back to, So Paracelsus, the chemical wedding of Christian Rosicrucius, begins with John Dee's philosophical key, the Monas Hieroglyphica symbol, which was based on Alberti's Hyperthermachia Polyphili. So that's a big thing. So Paracelsus' chemical wedding of Christian Rosicrucius begins with John Dee's philosophical key, the Monas Hieroglyphica symbol, which was based on, there's a lot of things that tie Alberti to this Rosicrucian, Freemason, because even Dante's Inferno mentions the Alberti family, and you see that Dante's Inferno was used by the Golden Dawn and by all kind of Masonic orders, right. Which I get into in the book, but let me stick to, so this international security director later influenced the first true Masonic manifesto through Paracelsus' prognostication Eximi Doctoris Paracelsus in 1530. So around 1530, the cross and the rose symbol appeared in Portugal at the Covenant of the Christ, former headquarters of the Knights Templar, who subsequently relocated to France and rebranded themselves as the Order. John Dee sold the Voynich manuscript to Emperor Rudolph around 1600. Dee and his spirit mediums resided in Bohemia for several years. Yet his personal diaries conspicuously omit any mention of the manuscript, a curious oversight. While radiocarbon analysis date the parchment to 1404 to 1438, the script may have been added decades later. Yes, hence the absence from these diaries, indicating a two-stage creation, vellum then cipher, by successive operatives. And this manuscript has been hit multiple times, and I get into there's probably at least 6 different figures that have had their hands on it. The adversary role was conferred upon Francis Bacon in 14. Okay, like D, Bacon received legal counsel from the Queen. He received names Viscount, Baron, Valoum. Francis Bacon's visionary ideas concerning locomotives, steamships, and electrical telegraph materialized by the 18th century. He ushered in today's modern age, spanning roughly 1450 to 1750. Now, that's interesting because the early modern age you could tie to, the age of exploration. Actually, I think I say this, excuse me. The early modern age was triggered by a convergence of transformative events during the lifetime of G. The fall of Constantinople, the invention of the printing press, and the Rosicrucian revival of classical knowledge, and the age of exploration. It is defined by the rise of nation states, global trade networks, scientific inquiry, humanism, and escape from medieval and modern institutions, laying the groundwork for capitalism, secure governments, and colonial empires. Bacon's humanist emphasis on scientific inquiry and rationalism also served a dual purpose. It subtly discouraged any questioning of their true motives, effectively framing dissent as irrational and outdated. Now, I could keep going because I don't know if is this sounding a little dull, guys? Could maybe a conversation might, because I got a few more paragraphs.
It's just a lot to take in, Michael. There's so much detail there. But if you've got a bit more paragraphs to do, we can do that, and then we can.
Let me blast through. I'm going to skip some of this because it gets into the Rothschilds and their potential connection to Bacon. All right. So the Vatican has regarded Rosicrucian as heretical since approximately 1738. Yep. Their suspicion of membership was potentially a capital offense. From the time of Bacon's birth, Britain gradually ascended to become the preeminent commercial nation. The Rothschilds innovated international finance, bond markets, and rapid communication, including networks to stay ahead of global finance. The new global trading empire established colonies in the Caribbean, North America. The British also achieved hegemony over the Indian continent. Bacon played a key role in establishing English speakers in Virginia, the Carolinas, and parts of Northwest Canada. This strategic expansion granted certain asymmetric threat units control over the Americas through the influence of Great Britain. Prior to 1776, several European powers had colonies in the Americas. Okay, we know that. The Anglo-Dutch Wars, India, okay? Perhaps Francis Bacon should be recognized, and I'll leave it at this. Perhaps Francis Bacon should be recognized as a founder of the United States because of his unfinished work, the New Atlantis, which outlines a utopian new world society in and that's essentially what it became.
Virginia was named after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I.
Right.
It was instrumental.
Right, exactly.
It's interesting. So also, go on, carry on, Michael.
Yeah, let me. So he did. Phil, if you wanted to interject, did you want to say something now?
I just thought it was. I just wanted to highlight. If you look at the history of the Royal Society, and when they were trying to get their charter off King Charles, not the one we have now, they sold the Royal Society as an avenue for improving technology with the aim of creating an empire. So they sold it to the king as a way of increasing maritime power, solving longitude, map-making, cartography, military, weapons technology. These were all sold reasons for the king to sort of put his weight behind this Royal Society and give them their first charter in whenever it was, 1660-ish.
That's cool. Yeah, man. It's fascinating to see how Britain managed to take over the world, and it's such a small part of the map. When you think about how this little tiny region just went
There's
It's
a really
such
good
pattern.
there's a really good book by a guy called Robert Lomas called The Invisible College, which lays down sort of the foundation of the Royal Society. It's really I'm sure you'd
Cool.
love it.
I'll check it out for sure. So let me just continue. I got a couple more. So Bacon and King James. This is also interesting because the King James version, at least in the United States, like for example, all jails read the King James version of the Bible. So, but a lot of places they go by, specifically Christian and Catholic denominations go by this King James version. And this was actually written with Bacon. Francis Bacon and King James were buddies. So they collaborated in remixing the New Testament. Again, a 16th century Karaite Masoretic text was their platform. Now, when I get into the Karaites, which is a sect of Judaism that basically only acknowledge the Bible, they don't really, or the Torah, they don't acknowledge the Talmud or anything. And they make out about 10%, not even like 1% of the Jewish population. But they're also responsible for, like, when you look at how the Star of David was associated with Jews, because before that it was an Aryan symbol. It was a Hindu symbol that it was in mandalas and stuff like that. But the point is these Karaites, mostly all the things that we associate with Judaism, you can trace back, like even the Torah, but they don't really believe in the same things that the vast majority of the Jewish population believe in, but somehow they've been controlling the text, and there's various ciphers in this text that get into it. But let me see. So because Bacon could not record his descendants, Bacon's titles became extinct upon his death in 1626 at 65 years old. A convenient narrative for a figure who operated under multiple identities. So, and I mentioned this earlier, how the New Chronology by Anatoly, he mentions how, because he mentions vaguely that the Medici and the printing press had something to do with the initial historical timeline, that the world, but he says that most of the history that we now, it happened in his time. And it's interesting because in 1582, the Gregorian calendar adjusted dates. This has nothing to do with scavenger. This is something I actually figured out on a large language model. The Julian J, if earlier reforms were secretly implemented, so they adjusted the dates to drift in the Julian calendar. If these early reforms were secretly implemented, they could have stretched or composed the time to create phantom centuries. So this is something that it's like technically feasible how they could have done this. I could get into the Jesuits, but basically after Francis Bacon, the mantle of intellectual and covert leadership purportedly passed to Athanasius Kircher, who was a Jesuit. That's 1602 to 1680. He was a German Jesuit. This relates to the German Rosicrucians, which bring us off to another place. We'll stop there. But do you guys have any questions or anything like that?
Just a few.
Who's Bacon?
Bacon. Swine, brother, swine.
Who do you think, as a two-part question, do you think the watch is still in operation today? And if so, who do you think's candidates for being members of the watch?
Well, yeah, the watch, number one, I named it the watch because it has a dual meaning. Number one, it's a timepiece, and it's also those who surveil. So when we look at who, I suspect, again, it's a global network. So they've compromised basically all intelligence services at some capacity. But they're mained, based on my timeline, it would be the English-speaking countries, the Anglophone countries. And there is an international spy ring that I keep forgetting his name. Yeah, the Five Eyes. But there's Edward Snowden. He was the one that outed them because it was classified up until a few years ago. And it's probably a decade by now that's been declassified. But the point is that, yeah, the countries that speak English, the Five Eyes started with the main countries New Zealand, Great Britain, so on and so forth, Australia. These guys, because this is where, the United States, this is where you get the internet from. DARPA, that's where the internet came from. That's where CERN, CERN was also in Switzerland. So there's a European connection, but it's really because, for example, it started with the Brusa Agreement, which is the Brits and the USA. When they got together to share intelligence, that's where I think we got the fusion of Francis Bacon's clique with George Washington's crew. But obviously, this was hundreds of years after. But that's where because originally, I don't think Washington wanted Francis Bacon around. I think that's why we don't consider him a founding figure, or at least I don't know if it was Washington personally, at least the people he was working for. But the point being is, yeah, I think it's the Five Eyes. But the Five Eyes is just, by now, that's old news for them. So if we're talking about it, that's why I had to call them the Watch, because as soon as that information is privy to the public, they've moved on. They're constantly rebranding themselves. And this has been happening for millennium. Once it reaches a critical mass, like that's why their whole thing is revolving around cryptography, because they're a secret society, But yeah, the Five Eyes is interesting when you get into the internet. Now, modern computers came from where? From the work of Turing, who also related to because the Enigma machine. What is the Enigma machine? It's an electronic polyalphabetic cipher. But if you were to go onto the Wikipedia page and look at the origins of computers, the first proto-computer was an Enigma machine. So, and it's interesting because DARPA, where you get the internet from, their logo is an eye with a triangle. All-seeing eye.
Really?
But guess where we get the all-seeing eye from? That comes from the Vatican in the 15th century via Alberti. Alberti's personal logo was an eye. That's the first known. I mean, obviously you can go to like the Eye of Horus or something like that, but that's not really a winged eye with a triangle. Yeah, you could say, okay, Egypt, the triangle, the pyramid. No, the reality is the first time the eye with the triangle was actually like a thing was in the 15th century Vatican, and it came from the work of Alberti. So, and when you think of an eye, a winged eye, because it first started off as a winged eye, and then the Vatican eventually put a triangle with the sun rays and stuff. The winged eye had sun rays, but the point is like, what is a winged eye? It's like a drone, it's like surveillance. It's like, or a satellite, it's like an eye in the sky. Look, you know what I mean? Like, I think these are like, it's all part of a strategy, a long strategy. That's why Alberti, Bacon, all these guys were obsessed with optics, because eventually this guy Kircher, that's where we get the actual camera from. The camera obscura comes from, so he followed this line of thought and eventually led to, like before, I would assume in espionage, you'd have to have a guy on every corner watching people and, but now once you get cameras and you can take pictures and vet information, that changed the game. And this is what I think happens is once, like, for example, the printing press, like there's cataclysms that seem, and major wars and major demographic shifts that seem to be happening after every major technological advancement related to the capturing of history. So World War I and World War II, specifically World War I, a lot of people associate that with the murder of Arch Ferdinand or something like this, the Duke. But this is like 10 years before that is when we first get video recording. And then like 20 years before that, we got audio recording. So right when we first start to figure out how to record things, all of a sudden these the huge friggin', world wars break out. I just think that's a convenient, I think it's convenient because I know that these people, like I say, the Watch, and sometimes it sounds a little, because after all, it's a name I made up. So it's not like, but there is a force that seems to be capitalizing off cataclysm to craft narratives. This goes back to the ancient flood, like the flood myth, for example. We associate that with somewhere in Iraq or something like that because history first started being recorded there. But if you actually think about it, and this is mainstream historians now concur with this, that flood myth came from the Black Sea, because there was an actual Black Sea deluge like 5000 BC, right before the advent of writing, right before. But this is when the Indo-Europeans of that region, that Black Sea region, Turkey, Ukraine, that whole Romania, that whole soup, that's where we started smelting metal, specifically the Vinca culture. So the Vinca culture, this is the first people that started using copper. Okay, eventually they got their tin from Britain, and that's where the Bronze Age started. And those people came down on horseback, and that's where we get the Sumerians and all these other people from. I noticed there's some videos that you have, and there was some other people talking about that, and we can get into that further too. But because British tin, when you think about the Bronze Age, I mean, copper, yes, smelting metal, that was a major thing, the Vinca. And speaking of the Vinca, these guys are also where we get proto-writing from. So modern historians are associating the proto-writing of the Vinca to Sumerian cuneiform. There are correspondences there. And it just so happens these are the same people that started smelting metal. Now, once you start smelting metal, size isn't as much of a problem. Before it was obviously we had weapons and stuff like that, stones and stuff like that. But when you have a sharp blade, there was obsidian, which I also get into because that's another telltale sign of the watch is the use of obsidian. And that goes all the way back to Neanderthals, which really gets into the weeds in terms of where the watch originated. Because I do believe the watch, I get it. I think that the watch is basically a consequence of what I've called the legacy reflex. And that relates to Neanderthals being outbred and essentially outnumbered by Homo sapiens. So people with Neanderthal admixture are predisposed for not only survival, but control. Like you see this in the United States, like the vast majority of preppers are usually, like white dudes, you know what I mean? And white people are apparently, I'm not demonizing Neanderthal. Listen, my 23andMe thing says I have more Neanderthal DNA than 70% of its customers. So I'm fucking caveman, bro. But my point is I've acknowledged that yes, there is, because there's like knee-jerk reactions. Like, don't get me wrong, I live in a city in Colombia where there's tens of thousands of people here, but there's no white people here. There's no English speaker. Like it's not like but the point is that I love it here. It's not, but I love being around. Listen, I've lived all over the world. I lived in Spain for 3 years. I lived in Italy for like 4 years. I've been to England, but only for a couple weeks.
It's long enough.
No, I have an option to go to Scotland now, but I'm not sure. Everything's just so cheap here, and but without veering off course, this legacy reflex, because I don't really get into this in previous conversations because it's a little taboo, and I try to stay away from. But the reality is even with Neanderthal admixture, truth be told, East Asians have more Neanderthal admixture than Caucasians. But East Asians are also mixed with what they call Denisovian.
Yep.
So that's where you get the elliptical eyes. But I think this legacy, but it's interesting because East Asians, they're considered like, their violent crime rate is very low if you see them in multicultural societies and stuff. But if you see like the top 3 highest body counts, or people with the highest body counts, are Genghis Khan, Mao, these guys, it's like 80 million, it's like, so there's a paradox there. Right. And I think this relates to this, because there's a growing body of evidence that suggests Neanderthals were behaviorally modern before Homo sapiens. They just didn't breed as fast. That's essentially how they lost the race, so to speak. But yeah, it's just one of those things where that's where it comes from. I think that's where it comes from, that gets into the weeds. It's interesting though, because you can trace the Neanderthal lineage down through the Venus figurines, because that's where there was a culture in Siberia called the Malta-Beret culture, and these are the progenitors of both Indo-Europeans and Native Americans. These are the same people that came from Siberia and crossed that strait. So a lot of people associate Native Americans with strictly like a people of an East Asian phenotype, but no, they were Central and East Asian, the original people that came. But the point being is, these people were the same people that came that created the Yamnaya, and the Yamnaya culture is considered the originators of Indo-Europeans. But you have to ask yourself, because the Malta-Beret, they were considered East. These were still relatively dark skin, dark hair. Allegedly, this is what the genetics are telling us. And then all of a sudden, 5,000 years ago, we get this HER2 mutation for blue eyes. And this is where you suddenly see the Sumerian dolls with the blue eyes, and you start to see all different kind of social stratification going on in the Middle East. But the point is that this HER2 mutation happened in the same region of this Black Sea region. And this is also where Noah's flood, Mount Ararat in Turkey. So it all revolves around this one region, which I get into the Indo-European, there's a lot of connections. So you have to ask yourself, how did this multi-beret, these Siberian, Eskimos, for lack of a better term, Inuits, they're not really either, but I guess you would say they're phenotypically similar to these people. How did they all of a sudden become these tall, blonde, redheaded people called Yamnaya? Because these were phenotypically different people, but they got exposed to Anatolian farmers. And that's what essentially created what we would consider white people today. But the reason I bring this up is because you could actually trace that Neanderthal lineage from those East Asians down to the Yamnaya through the Venus figurines and the Natufian culture. Because the Natufian culture in ancient Canaan also inhabited, that's where we get Göbekli Tepe from. That's where we get Jericho from. That's where the oldest things on earth. That's where we get dog domestication from, the Natufians. Because dog domestication, that was the first animal that we domesticated. Right. After we were able to domesticate, and I don't know if we really domesticated, it sounds more like we were hanging out with wolves, or the wolves were hanging out with us, and eventually, like the hunter-gatherers, and we started, I guess they became our friends, so to speak. But I don't know. Like I said, this is just my research, but these are other people's research that I'm going on. The point is that dog domestication led to horse domestication, because the Malta Beret, which was around 25,000 years ago to about 13,000 years ago, came in contact with the Natufians, which is about 15,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. This is during the Younger Dryas event, where it basically there was a bottleneck, and it was a merger of these people. And that's where you get, so this is how the watch crystallizes. And the reason I bring all of this up is because it all ties into behavioral modernity. Because you have to ask yourself, how did the watch originally have the upper hand on these bicameral societies? And I argue that Neanderthals, or specifically Neanderthal Homo sapien hybrids, that had to battle the weather, because that's where we get beards from. Beards are not, if you look at indigenous cultures and throughout the world, they don't have beards. Indigenous Black people, indigenous Indians, indigenous, and indigenous is a but I'm saying, like, originally that phenotype, you know what I mean? Because basically you get beards from a Neanderthal, even like the original progenitors of civilization. Like when I argue that this Neanderthal hybrid battling the weather predisposed those people to a form of introspection and self-awareness that allowed them to essentially manipulate people that were still bicameral.
Right.
And we see this with the bearded progenitors of civilization, like Sargon of Akkad, or all these, these Sumerians, or the Egyptian bearded people.
Noah.
Indigenous people from those Iraq.
Moses.
Yeah. I'm just saying, there's an archetypal thing going on with these bearded people.
Jeremy Beadle.
Zeus.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
fascinating.
It's pretty wild.
Well, Michael, we've blown right over through an hour already.
And I don't think you've even referred to your notes, Phil, have you?
No, I had 2 pages of notes.
I didn't need them.
Might as well. No. Yeah. Didn't need it. No,
listen, I'll always come back whenever you guys want me to come back. Or we can keep going, whatever you guys want to do.
We've got to do part 2 yet.
Yep.
What time is it? It's 9:15. So yeah, we should wrap up pretty soon, Michael. I really appreciate your time, and we've had some positive comments in the chat. JC says this man's on fire.
Yeah,
really need to watch this again. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Tell people where they can follow you. How's the best way to get the book and all that good stuff.
Sure.
Michael.
So, my website is right here on the screen, michaelanthonyalberta.com. My books are free. The audio book, because it's constantly being updated. I have the original. It's called The Renaissance Man. This is before LLMs and stuff like that, before AI. That's when I just basically used Wikipedia. I've since revisited it with all kinds of large language to kind of vet my information and make sure I got it, because there was a lot of stuff in the original that was speculative and but you can get that original on Amazon and basically see what I came up with before AI, which is remarkably similar, but that was compiled over a 10-year period. But no, yes, my books are available. The book is available for free. I do personal training, virtual personal training. I have another book called The Living Code, where I applied the same methodology to people's personal lives to kind of help them. I apply the work of like Jordan Peterson and his self-authoring program with Greg Braden's fractal time theory to help people kind of decipher their own histories and figure out the traumas or figure out different parts of their lives that they can see the patterns. It's basically a matter of we're pattern recognition machines and allowing us to uncover these things, not just in the world history, but our own histories. But ultimately, bro, honestly, I just end up training people, giving people, meal plans, training with them at the gym, sometimes virtually with cameras and stuff. So any way like that, that's essentially what I do. And
Cool.
Other than that, thanks, guys. I know it's getting late for you. I appreciate everything, man. I hope to talk to you soon.
No problem.
Cheers,
Can you get the book in a physical copy?
No, well, you can get the original, the
Right.
Renaissance Man. The original is available in paperback. Yes. And,
Cool.
But that's on Amazon. Yeah.
Sound. Right. Well, thanks, Michael. We'll leave it there, and
Yeah.
good luck with your continuing research and projects. And
Thank you, guys.
And you have a
Thank
YouTube channel as well, don't you?
Yeah. Michael Alberta at Michael Alberta. That's
Drop him a sub, watch some videos.
Yeah.
cool.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday, Michael. It's been a treat.
Yeah.
Same to you guys. Same to you guys.
No worries. For those of you listening live, we're going to take a quick break, 5 minutes or so, and come back and do some news, some headlines and whatnot.
News. Yeah.
Okay. All right. See you for part 2 very shortly. Ta-ra.
Cheers, Michael.
Right.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Michael.
See you in a bit.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers. Ben, Matt, Phil.
Bye.
Later.